Nevada Secretary of State Francisco Aguilar speaking today on the success of the 2024 election cycle.
And he says that everything wasn't perfect and there still is more work to be done, but the state saw record numbers in voter turnout and registration.
In total, more than 2 million people registered to vote, and 73% of those people voted. 45% of voters did so by mail, 37% by early voting, and 18% on election day.
And compared to the 2020 election, the younger vote turnout exceeded all expectations, with 57% of people ages 18 to 29 casting their ballot. That's an increase of 4% from 2020. The younger vote in Nevada blew past the national average of 42%.
To those volunteering their time on Election Day, more than 3,000 people signed up to work. Secretary Aguilar says the new website to encourage new poll workers and high schools helped get the numbers up.
And when it comes to poll worker safety, the Election Worker Protection Act passed last year, and it proved effective. To date, there were no reports of incidents that escalated that needed to use that act.
Secretary Aguilar touted election workers' efforts, saying in part, whether they're engaged year-round in preparing and executing the election, or whether they were a poll worker on Election Day, election workers are truly the unsung heroes of democracy, and we can't thank them enough.